everybody. We're happy to have you here. If you haven't already, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat.
Oh, lost it.
You can let us know your name and the age of the children that you're here representing. And then we would love to have everybody mute themselves so that the presenters can be heard clearly. Thanks for being here this afternoon. We definitely see a theme in the chat of memories from standardized testing. All right. We are recording this evening's presentation so that folks who were not able to make this time are able to watch it later. Colleen, I think I'll toss to you to kick it off.
Fabulous, thanks. Welcome everyone. We're thrilled to have you with us this evening. And as Ilsa mentioned and named, there seems to be a bit of a theme in the chat around experiences with standardized testing involving some stress and anxiety. We're hoping that our conversation tonight can help allay some of that for you as you think about the experience for your child. But most importantly, that it will allay some of that for your child. One thing we know about children is that they very clearly pick up on the feelings and the vibes of the adults around them. And we're hoping that the information we have to share with you this evening can quiet some of your concerns and set you and your child up for a successful and smooth week that feels very similar to other weeks at school. We're going to start off with just some very quick introductions of the people who are leading this presentation. I'm Colleen Shilley. I'm the Associate Head of School. Ilsa, do you want to quickly introduce yourself and then toss it to Jason?
Yeah, welcome everyone. I'm Ilsa Doman. I'm the Director of Teaching and Learning, and we're joined also this evening by someone from ERB.
Hi everyone, my name is Jason Lesnetsky. Very happy to be with you tonight. I'm a Member Services Director with ERB. Been with ERB for 9 years. Really excited to be working with Hillbrook this year. Been partnering with Ilsa and Colleen preparing for this and helping them prepare for the testing, and really looking forward to sharing some information with you tonight.
Thanks for joining us, Jason.
All right, this evening we hope to give you some answers and some framing for these key questions. Jason is going to walk us through some specifics and details about what is the ERB CTP assessment and what all of those letters stand for. We are going to talk a little bit about when the ERB is taken and how we administer it, both here on campus, and we'll talk a little bit about how it can be administered for families who are distance learning. We'll talk a little bit about how we prepare children for the ERB at school, and we'll give you some tips about how you can mirror the ways that we prepare children at home. We're going to talk a little bit about why we choose to use the ERB. We'll give you a reminder about some of the things that the ERB doesn't tell us about your child. And then we'll end with some specific actions you can take when you receive your child's results and how we can support you and your child in next steps. All right.
Great. This is my slide. So a little bit about our assessment. So just very quickly, ERB is a not-for-profit organization that works mostly with independent schools, and we provide several different types of assessments. The one that
Sweetheart,
Hillbrook—
I can't listen. I'm listening to the meeting. I'm sorry.
So the assessment we're talking about tonight is our CTP, our comprehensive testing program, and it is a norm reference standardized test. And I definitely understand the feelings in the chat. You know, I was a student as well and had those same feelings growing up, but we do think about the CTP, and I love the proactiveness of Colleen and Ilsa working to kind of alleviate some of those concerns and hopefully some of that anxiety around testing. We really do think of the CTP as a snapshot of student learning, just to give everybody an idea of where students are, how curriculum is fitting in as a school, and larger picture ideas. So anything you can do to just emphasize that, just to do their best, that's all they can do is take time on every question, do the best they can, and, we'll use the results, the best that we can to increase their education. So just very quickly, the CTP is broken down into a couple of large areas: our verbal tests and our math tests. The verbal is verbal reasoning, vocabulary, reading comprehension, writing mechanics, and writing concepts and skills. You'll notice most of them make sense what are covered in those areas, except for verbal reasoning, which is, it's a test, a subtest we have that most other tests out there don't. And it does give you an idea of a student's potential learning or ability in that area. It's not like an IQ test. It's not a 3-hour battery with a licensed psychologist like you would get there, but we do use higher order thinking and critical thinking type questions to give that idea of a student's potential in the broad verbal and mathematics areas. The other thing that's pointed out on this slide is what standards our test is based on. And we go back to what we believe are the most basic standards out there. So on the verbal side, it's the NCTE, which is the National Council for Teachers of English, and the ILA, the International Literacy Association. And then on the math side, it's the NCTM, the National Council for Teachers of Mathematics. All right, so if any of you here in the probably middle grades and your student has taken the CTP for prior to 3 years ago, we made a change in 2018 from the CTP4 to the CTP5. Basically, it was due for an update, and we made a couple of changes at that time. We had a group of testing experts help us with that transition. And one of the main things that they recommended we adjust is our scaled score ranges. So you might have noticed, if you have any reports from prior to 2018, that the numbers were a lot smaller back then, and now they're larger. They still equate to each other, and we've made all the adjustments on our end to those scaled scores. But if you do go back that far, you will notice that change. Otherwise, the scaled score is how we measure growth over time. So it's how we show learning over time as well. So if you hold on to those reports over the years, in each one of the subtests, you'll see that scaled score increases, meaning that the student is learning, growing from one grade level to the next. One of the other major changes we made is over the years, many recent years, there's been a new look at types of questions, and it's based on Webb's depth of knowledge. And this just shows the different complexities of a question as opposed to the difficulty of a question. And I'm going to show some samples in a minute, but basically our team of experts said that there were, mostly level 1 and level 2 questions in the previous version, and they believe that you should have more level 2 and level 3. So we wanted to have an even spread of those different types. And this just really helps us, like I said, not just look at, what a student does and doesn't know, but how they answer questions as well. So here are a few samples. Go ahead. Next slide, there you go. So the first example is going to be what's called a DOK level 1 question. And this once again stands for depth of knowledge. And a level 1 question would be really rote memory or simple calculations on the math side. So you notice the example here, the level 1 question would basically be choose the word that is closest in meaning to the word in capital letters. So just typical vocabulary, understanding what a word means. Next slide. And then a level 2, when you jump to that, it not only requires some kind of recall, but an extra step they have to take beyond that. So in this case, for DOK2, choose the word that is most nearly the opposite in meaning to the word. So not only do they need to know the definition of the word, but they have to make that additional step of understanding what the opposite of that word is. And then next slide. And then a level 3 requires some kind of analysis, some kind of processing going on for the student to get from one place to the next. So once again, for vocabulary, there's an entire passage of reading there. And then the question is, which of the following possible replacements for the word speculate in the second paragraph in the passage would imply a more scientific tone? So once again, not only do they need to know what the words mean, but how they fit within a passage as well. So it requires that extra level of analysis. And then on the math side, starting with DOK level 1 again, obviously just wrote kind of computation. So a DOK level 1 question would be 3 to the 3rd power. Just recall or know what that calculation would be. A level 2 question would be, which of the following points best represents 3/5 on the number line below? So not only do they need to know what 3/5 is, but you can see from the number line, it's broken down into tenths. So they have to take that extra step to be able to convert from 3/5 to tenths and then find where that would be on the number line. And then a DOK level 3 would be some kind of word problem. And in this case, it's actually going to the next level of probability and actually calculating, using the information they have to calculate the probability of something happening as well. So once again, that higher level analysis. Now, every question, test question, has a difficulty level. In other words, what percentage of students get them right and wrong, and it's based on psychometric figures, things like that. Where depth of knowledge is more this kind of rubric based, what is the complexity of a question? All right, so once you kind of understand the basics of the CTP test itself, the next few slides, we're going to talk about just some basic statistical terminology. And as you're looking at the parent reports that will be coming home to you and what you've seen in the past, it's important to understand what those numbers refer to. So as I mentioned earlier, the CTP is a normed reference test. So what that means is it's basically used to compare your student scores to other groups of students. Once again, one of the nice things about our assessment that others out there don't have is we have more than one norm. Most tests out there, like the Iowa Basic Skills Test, the Stanford 10, it only has one norm, the national norm, which is very important. It allows you to compare your student scores to any other student in the United States. Public school, charter school, independent school, inner city, rural, suburban, all types of students across the United States would be in that norm. So very important to be able to make that comparison. But we offer another norm. Since we work with so many independent schools, we allow you to also compare your student scores to other independent school students. So more their peer group of other, like schools that they might be attending. So just two different ways of looking at the data. And I'll talk a little bit more about, the difference in those going forward. All right, so once again, norm reference test. If you're talking about percentile rankings and stanines, then you really need to know the basics of a standard bell curve. And this is just a great reminder of how bell curves work, a normal distribution. As you can see in the slide, the bulk of the students in any particular norm pool, whether it's the national norm or the independent school norm, are going to fall in the middle of the bell curve. And I'm going to talk about the differences between percentiles and stanines, but you can see at the bottom, the 4, 5, 6 stanine has the largest group of students falling in this area. And then the 1, 2, 3 stanines would be kind of the below the average, the middle of the group. There's far fewer students fall into that 1, 2, and 3 stanine. And then the same thing happens at the top. There's a very small percentage of students in a norm pool are able to achieve a 7, 8, and 9 stanine, just because the nature of the statistics. So it's just a really good reminder to see that. And just as an example, let's say you look down on the bottom where you see the number 77. If you followed that dotted line up to the bell curve, you would see that your student performed better than 77% of the students in that particular group. And that's that whole bulk that would fall to the left of that dotted line. So that's kind of how that works. Okay, next slide. And then this is just the slide that shows how you can compare stanines and percentile rankings. Percentile rankings are great. It tells you what percentage your student performed better than. The stanines are really nice because you can simplify, right? You can glance at a report, and if you see that your child is 6s and 7s on the math side, but 4s and 5s on the reading, language, art side, the student's obviously a stronger math student than verbal. You can quickly see that. But you do need to be careful about relying too much on the stay nines. You always want to fall back on the percentiles, because notice at the bottom and top of the scale, let's look at the bottom first, the difference from a 1 to 2 stay nine is usually very small. It's either 1 point from a 3 to a 4, or 9 points from a 1 to a 10. So it's a 1 to 10 range to get to 1 stay nine. But notice in the middle of the bell curve, from a 4 to a 5 stay nine, it can be 1 point from a 39 to a 40, or 36 points from a 23 to a 59. So just remember, you always want to fall back on those percentile ranks for that more granular look at the data. All right. So next, as you start to look at the parent reports, besides percentile ranking and stay nine, you are going to see that scaled score. We already talked about it a little bit because we made that adjustment from the CTP 4 to the CTP 5. And one of the things I mentioned was that the every year your student scaled score should increase, showing learning growth from one year to the next. And that's because our scaled scores are vertical, meaning that at the lower grades, let's say as an example, in first grade, the scale score might go from 100 to 200. For second grade, it might go from 150 to 250. So it continues to go up and overlap as a student increases in grade. And this just shows the learning, development, advancement of the curriculum that happens as students learn and grow through the grades. But then you also might want to know what range of scores you want to look at. We don't really like to lock in numbers, but if you're kind of looking for a kind of overall increase you might see from one year to the next, with this new scaled score range, it'll be around 40 to 60 points. In the lower grades, closer to 40, and in the middle upper grades, closer to 60. But don't get too hung up on that increase. As long as the number is going up, it's showing learning, showing growth from one year to the next. All right, so one of the big questions, of course, is, this has been a crazy year, obviously, a very difficult year. And of course, ERB is looking at, testing in the new COVID reality and what has happened over this last year. So we've performed some internal studies and made some decisions based on that. So just a few points that ERB has brought about. Most of our schools test in the spring. We actually offer testing throughout the year, but most of our schools test in the spring. So obviously last spring, when everybody was under quarantine, we had very few schools that were able to test. So we actually are not including last year's scores in our norm pool. So that was the first thing we decided. They just would not be a good indicator to compare your student scores against. So basically what that means is your student scores this year are going to be compared to they're always compared to the previous 3 years of scores. We use what's called 3-year rolling norms, but your students will be compared to the 3-year prior to last year's scores going this year. So just something to take into account as you're looking at them, that you're looking at post-COVID, with all the realities of distance learning, of the stresses on children, adjustments to teaching, all of those things compared to pre-COVID scores across all of our independent schools. And then finally, we've actually done a study over this first year just to track, how much we've seen change in student scores post-COVID versus pre-COVID. And so far, we're seeing about a 30 to 40% decrease in learning growth from last year to this year, or from prior years to this year. So that's another thing to look out for. One of the other things we saw is there's been public school studies out there showing up to 8 to 9 months of learning loss in those schools, and we're seeing less of that across most of our independent schools.
Thanks, Jason. And
Sure.
of course, much of what Jason just shared, it might either already be familiar to you or might still feel very new, and it was a lot. You'll have written resources that you can use to refresh yourself on those terms once you get your report. And of course, we're always happy to have questions and help you look back at those terms. So then thinking about how the CTP will look at Hillbrook, we are returning to sort of a typical testing type this spring. So we're going to be taking it around the usual time that we would have had last year. if we ignore last year as not normal, which is going to be Monday to Friday from May 3rd to the 7th. And the way that we've done that typically, and that we'll do it this year, is that children at each grade level within the course of their regular school day, mostly in the morning periods, will take a couple of subtests a day, but one at a time. And so having breaks in between within the course of their normal classes. So they'll go to their normal first period with their normal classmates and teachers, and they'll take the test, the first subtest, and then have a break, and then take another subtest. And we'll break out all the subtests over the course of those 5 days. Children at school have been taking the ERB, the CTP test on iPads for a number of years. We'll continue that this year. And then at home for ERB's at home process, which we can talk more about with families who will be taking advantage of that, children will be using a laptop.
Thanks, Elsa. So continuing off of what Elsa's saying, she's talking mostly about our administration process in school. And this year we are able, with some of the systems that ERB has designed, to offer the ERB test administered at home if your family is still choosing the distance learning option. And if that is the case, you should have received an email from me earlier this week with your 3 choices for this year. You were able to follow ERB's at-home testing procedure, which the email I sent earlier this week has some real specific details about what that procedure is. You might also choose to come to campus only for the test taking times, where we will offer a physically distanced outdoor proctored testing area for your child. Or you may choose not to participate in testing this year. I'm going to put the form again in the chat. If you are here and you're a distance learning family, as a reminder that we need that form back for tomorrow. One of the things we need to do is organize our proctoring. And so we need to make sure that we have proctors ready to proctor the distance learners who are taking the test from home, the ones who are taking the test in their classrooms, and then any distance learners who might choose to come to campus only for test taking times. And so we ask that you'd fill that form out by tomorrow. If you're having trouble figuring out what the best decision is for your family, please send me an email this evening, and I'm happy to find some time to chat with you either on Friday or Monday to help you navigate that decision for you and your child.
So then we are at school, of course, going to be preparing children in the coming weeks, specifically for what to expect with the CTP test. And these are some of the ways that that's going to look for your child. One is that every child 3rd through 8th grade is going to have a specific lesson with their cohort or homeroom teacher that just goes over kind of like what the test is, when they're going to be taking it, and why. And the way that we frame the why for children across 3rd through 8th grade here is that the CTP gives us information about your teacher's information about what you already know really well, and helps us decide what to best teach you next. We also share with children, for example, that different from other kinds of school tests, the ERB is designed to show you some problems that maybe you've never seen before. And that's just normal and should be expected. We're going to be explicitly teaching test taking strategies. So that includes something that would look pretty familiar to anybody who maybe took a course to study for the GRE or the SAT, around like, how do you read a question carefully, looking out for words like never or always or opposite? How do you do a little bit of scratch work on your paper and pencil? And then how do you think in your mind about what a good answer would be before then reading all of the answer choices and selecting the best one? We also are teaching strategies for things like, what if the question is about a word that I don't know? Or what if I really just have tried for a couple minutes and I'm stuck on a problem? What should I do next? So teaching children about maybe, for example, eliminating a couple of wrong answers and then guessing from what remains. We're also talking with children about using their inner coach for things like if you're feeling nervous or if you need to speed up or slow down, using your deep breaths, using your inner coach to talk to yourself and give yourself kind of a pep talk. We're also using, in the course of practicing those test taking strategies, we're using practice questions from the CTP test. So we'll be through that also then introducing kids to what those questions look like and giving them some practice with that style of question. And then we also are making time within that cohort class time for children to use the tutorial so that they're actually on their iPad using the ERB app and going through the navigation. And that gives them practice with the test taking strategies and practice questions, but really is focused on what will the test look like? Where will the button be located? How will it feel to select an answer? What if I need to change my mind? And how do I tap that? How can I hide the clock if the timer is making me feel rushed or stressed out? So those are some of the ways that we are preparing children on campus to take the test. And then why does Hillbrook choose to use this particular tool? So we administer the ERB every spring for a couple of reasons. Because so many independent schools, as Jason said, use this particular tool to measure growth according to national standards that we care about, it can be a really helpful way for us to find out how Hillbrook children are performing compared to their peers in the national group, which is useful to us because many of our children will go on to a public school, will go on, and that national norm group is the group, for example, if they take the SAT, that they would be testing against. It also allows us to look at their performance compared to other independent schools. In addition to that, we know that the ERB is just one snapshot, but it does give us information about an individual student's strengths and weaknesses, and becomes a part of the data set that's passed year to year when teachers welcome a new class in the fall, prior to students coming onto the campus every year. Part of our transition process for classes moving up, teachers receive a data packet for every child, and the ERB scores are summary scores are a part of that packet that teachers are looking at to welcome a new class, thinking about not only individual children's relative strengths and weaknesses, but also kind of the makeup of the group that they're welcoming in that year. We can then use that throughout the year for things like creating small groups, or thinking about compared to maybe a prior year, not every fourth grade class is the same or shows up the same. What does that year's group really need more of or less of? Finally, we use the ERB data. We rely on it as an administrative team, but also as faculty teams conduct program audits. When we've made a tweak to something in our program, introduced a new curricular resource, or made a change in the relative amount of time we're spending on something, the ERB is another way that we can sort of check the hypotheses and assumptions that we had when making that change, and can help us look out over time for trends in the way that our program is performing compared to others.
All right, so this is me again. So next we're actually going to go ahead to the next slide. I can't remember if I think it goes right into the report. Yeah, so this is the report that you received. So really the parts I talked about earlier kind of set up and make a lot of sense. So what you're going to see on this report is, on the left-hand side, a list of all of the subtests that your student took at school that was administered to them. And then the next column will be the scaled score. We already talked about that quite a bit. That's just kind of the basic, what we convert the raw score to the scaled score is kind of just the set number that's in there. There's no comparison there. It's just kind of a flat number. But we use the scaled score to build the bell curves. And that's the number that I mentioned. If you hold on to previous year's reports, you will see that number increase in each one of those areas, showing learning and growth. And then the next couple of columns are based on the bell curve slide that I showed, and the percentile rankings and stay-nines. So you see the numbers in the national norm group, the percentiles 59, 69, 85. Basically, that top line means that in the national norm group, so versus any other type of student in the United States, this student performed better than 59% of the students in verbal reasoning, better than 69% of the students in vocabulary, and so on. And then it has the stay-nines that equates to, this 5, 6, 7. So you can just kind of do that quick glance. And then you see the independent school norm, the scores that are there. Same thing. And against all independent school students, this student scored at better than 21% of all independent school students in verbal reasoning. Now, you'll note that the percentages drop quite a bit. And the reason for that is the independent school norm is obviously a more difficult group of students to compare against. These are all students that have applied to independent schools, have probably taken an admissions test and been admitted to independent schools. So they tend to perform higher academically. So the whole pool as a whole is a higher, academic group. And so obviously comparing that same score to, more peer students is going to make the percentage drop. Now, sometimes the percentage will drop quite a bit, sometimes not a lot, and that's just related to where it all falls on the bell curve, the differences between that national norm and independent school norm. And then once again, the stay nines for the independent is the same thing. It's just going to give you an idea of, simplification of 4, 5, 6, in the main middle area of the bell curve, or the 1, 2, 3, or the 7, 8, 9. The bottom half of the report is just a graphical representation of the top. So you see the numbers across the top: 10, 25, 50, 75, and 90. So it represents where your student falls versus the national norm. So when you're looking at this, you're looking at the diamonds on the right-hand side are going to be the strengths for the student, and the diamonds on the left are going to be areas that maybe they could do a little more work, or that they're not as strong in. And then, of course, the shaded bars are indicated as the probable range of scores. And this is really just a plus or minus, kind of not really a standard error of measurement, but that's what I kind of call it. It's basically if the student took the test many different times using different forms of the test and had good days, not so good days, this is their possible range of scores that they might have. So in this example, the student performed around, the diamond is around the 55 percentile, but they could have gotten as low as like a 45, 48%, but as high as a 74% as well. And this just takes into account the variability of the test and, that type of thing. And then the bottom half of that page just gives you a little description of what's covered in each one of the subtests.
Thanks, Jason.
Mm-hmm.
So now's a great time for everyone to just take a deep breath and get rid of all those negative memories of testing that you have, and sort of sit with the reminder that there's a lot that this very brief in the course of your child's school year test that it doesn't tell us about who your child is and how we work with them at Hillbrook. It doesn't have a bearing on identifying or measuring their intelligence or their future success or the things they're interested in or passionate about, or their kindness or their curiosity or their growth mindset or their resilience or their willingness to take risks. And obviously, as you all know, and this seems very obvious, but is worth really emphasizing and saying, there's so much more that this assessment doesn't tell us about your child. And one of the things that we're going to talk about in a few moments, but I'll say here as well, is as you process the results, we ask that you also remember that we're here as a school to partner with you in understanding how those results fit in as a small piece of the overall puzzle of who your child is as a learner and a member of our community and our school. Your children's teachers have a ton of incredibly valuable insight. Ilsa and I and Amy and Kelly are willing to sit with you and talk about the things we both know about your child, but also about our school and our program and the test taking experience that can help create a whole, well-rounded picture of which this data is an interesting and useful part, but it is only one piece. And so we wanted to stick that reminder here as we've thrown a lot of information at you about what the testing experience is like and how to read results, that to remind you that it is one piece of a very large puzzle that makes up the gift that your child is to you and to our school. And so another important question that we know you're asking is, how can you best support your child as they prepare, as you prepare? And so we have a couple tips. One is to pack an extra morning snack, and that food that children get. We know that not all children are hungry for breakfast in the morning, but having that snack with them means that they can eat and take care of their body when they're ready to do that. Most importantly, helping your child get plenty of sleep And we pair that with the follow your typical routines for each day of testing. Significantly changing your family's routine around testing can overemphasize the importance of these tests for children and create some anxiety. Their routine that they follow with you regularly is the thing that anchors them to home and school life. And there's no reason for you to significantly change it because of the testing experience. And so we urge you to certainly make sure your child gets sleep, but to minimize any significant disruptions in an attempt to force a special routine that can actually be counterproductive. We ask that you echo our messages about the tests, that it helps teachers know what to teach children next. It helps, or it's important to try your best, but also not to be nervous. Again, this is one moment. They do lots of things at school that tell us about who they are as a learner, and this is one of them. It's also, and Ilse mentioned this earlier, it's also really helpful to differentiate for them that this is not like a lot of other tests that they take at school. And it's designed actually to show children some problems that they haven't practiced before, which means that if they get a problem that seems really hard and challenging, it's not because they're dumb. It's not because they don't know something. It's because the test is really trying to understand how, what kinds of hard things they can do and what kinds of things they're ready to learn next, which means everybody who takes this test is going to see something that they haven't seen before, and that's okay. And if you can provide that, those messages to your child, they'll hear it at school and they'll hear it from you and they'll know we're all on the same page together. And the last thing that we offer as a way to support your child is to coach your specific child. You know your kid, you know if the test is if going to make them feel anxious, you know how they show up to their schoolwork. Are they someone who needs to slow down? Are they someone who needs to speed up? The same coaching doesn't apply for every child. You may be one of those lucky parents who has one of each in your household, a child who needs to slow down and a child who needs to speed up. You might offer to, if your child needs to slow down, you might offer to them that they could use their scratch paper for every math problem, and offer them the coaching that it should be filled up by the end of the math test. If your child is someone who takes their time and really needs to pace themselves, you might offer to them the strategy of eliminating wrong answers and then guessing between the remaining ones. And for students who have, for most of our students in the community who are taking the test, they will have a timer. It's small in the upper corner of the iPad, and that lets them know how much time remains for them. And keeping an eye on that can help them pace themselves. Shannon, I see you also asked about preparation in school for fourth graders and third graders. All of our teachers are getting some of this. Ilse mentioned some of the things we're offering teachers or providing for teachers to prep children with, and all students will get that this year. So fourth graders will get the same kind of prep and support that third graders will get, and that other middle school students will get as well. All right, so before we move on to some of the other questions that I know are in the chat, the last thing we want to talk through with you is what you can do when you get your child's results. And we will share results with your child's second semester report card in June. And so the first piece of things to do when you get your child's reports may seem obvious, but I put it on here because your child's results will come with an explanatory sheet for how to understand standardized assessment scores. And Jason has walked through a lot of that information with you here today, and this recording will continue to be available if watching a recording is helpful for you. But it's important, and as Ilse noted earlier, to remember that standardized assessments are designed really differently from assessments in school. And when you look at the results, if you jump right to looking at the numbers without reminding yourself how to understand the statistical analysis that comes with a standardized assessment, you might draw some conclusions that are erroneous about your child's performance and who your child is and what their strengths and weaknesses are. Standardized assessments, as Jason noted, are intended to have a really high ceiling which has really challenging questions that only a few students can answer, and a really low floor where only a few students get those questions wrong, because that helps us determine or helps ERB determine the bell curve. And so, as Jason pointed out, it means the average student will get only about 50% of the test questions correct, because that helps the bulk of the students fall in those 4th, 5th, and 6th stay nines that he pointed out to us. And because understanding standardized assessments and standardized terminology is not something many of us have to do typically, reading that score interpretation explanatory sheet is going to be really important for you as you interpret the accompanying numbers on your child's score report. The next reminder we want to offer is that results are meant to be are written and meant to be read by adults. As a school, we really urge you not to share the direct score report with your child. Understanding, as I said, statistical analyses of standardized assessments is complicated, and even for adults. And for children who lack a nuanced understanding of what standardized numbers and stay nines and percentiles and norms mean, it can result for them in an unhelpful quantification of their performance or their value. And so instead, we recommend pulling out 2 to 3 areas of relative strength and 1 area for improvement if your child is interested in their performance. So for example, you might say, you're showing a lot of growth in your reading comprehension and vocabulary. That's awesome. And it looks like we want to work on slowing down and using the scratch paper for your math assessment next year. So those are some of the things that we can work through with you as we help you interpret your results on how you might share information to your child if they are interested. Thirdly, we ask that you consider how you process thoughts and questions. Messages children hear and sometimes accidentally overhear between adults about themselves can contribute to either a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. And this can lead to sort of a self-concept around their performance, good or bad. It can be just as detrimental for a child's mindset if they think of themselves as smart and high performing as it can be if they struggle. And how they learn to think about scores and test performance is going to be something that they absorb from you and from us at school. And so we ask that you be really mindful of when you read the score report and how you process it, because your children are learning from you about how to interpret how this data point fits into their overall sense of who they are as a learner. And finally, please ask for help. Ilsa, Amy, and I will make ourselves available during June and August to connect with you about your child's scores, particularly if you'd like help interpreting them. We do this, the only summer we haven't done it is last summer, because we didn't take the ERB CTPs last year, but we're very familiar with how important and useful it is to sit with individual families to talk about your child's individual testing experience. Another thing that we do during those meetings is we can provide more granular information about your child's test taking experience. It can be hard when you see one sheet of numbers to understand how that set of numbers was produced over the course of a child's week. And your children's proctors will keep notes on things they notice about your child during the test taking experience. They'll also keep rough estimates of how long it took your child to finish certain tests, and that can often be really illuminating for understanding your child's score. We'll also save the scratch paper that your children use during the test so that we can take a look at that together and understand, out of 40 math problems, did your child only attempt to do 2 on paper? And is that then the area for growth? Is using the strategies available to them? Or did they do a lot of work and we need to look at that and understand more about how we can support them moving forward? These are pieces of additional data that we collect that we want to be able to share with you. So please make sure that you ask for that help and meet with us to interpret how these tests again fit into your overall understanding of who your child is as a learner. And with that, I think we have some time for questions. And I'm going to scroll back up because I think there was.
Yeah, I see the first one, Jason, I think maybe you could be helpful with, was about how the IC compares to the CTP. And then I think we can add on about how often we see the IC show up as a requirement for high school applications, but that was also part of that question.
Sure, perfect. So yeah, I can address the CTP and IC part. ERB does make both assessments and offer both assessments, the CTP and the IC. Whoever, if anybody's not aware, the IC is the Independent School Entrance Exam, our admissions assessment. So they are similar to each other, but also different is really the main answer. And then there's no direct correlation between the two, just because they're different types of tests for different purposes. So the IC being it's for admissions actually looks outside of the grade level that the student's applying for, a couple of grade levels below and a couple of grade levels above. And then it also has a different norm pool. It's students applying to independent schools, not students that are in independent schools. So those are the real differences. But because we make both assessments, there are also a lot of similarities. We use the same standards for both tests, the NCTM and NCTE. The item writing is very similar between the two. The subtests match up: reading comprehension, mathematics, verbal reasoning, quantitative reasoning. And we also kind of find that obviously students that do well on the IC tend to do well on the CTP. So those are really kind of they're similar, but different.
Thanks for that.
Sure.
And if you're thinking about whether or not your child will want to be taking the IC as part of their preparation for high school, we can answer that question more one-on-one because it depends a lot the kinds of schools that you're looking at. And our high school counselor, Eden Maisel, can also be a great asset and resource to your family as you start to kind of map forward what it will look like for your child entering high school and getting ready for that. The next question, Jason, I'll also toss to you, was about whether or not the CTP is adaptive in any way.
Yeah, so one of the benefits of an online test is that it can be adaptive, and there are different types of adaptive tests out there. Ours is a form adaptive test, and what that means is that the first half of every subtest is the same for all students in the grade level, but based on how they do in the first half, they're routed to either a more difficult form or an easier form in the second half. Now, this is seamless to the students. They have no idea that this is really going on. There's a review screen in the middle, but it's seamless and seems like it's kind of a breaking point to check your answers up to that point. But what it allows us to use is a philosophy of testing called item response theory to calculate a student's score, to alleviate some of that stress that we talk about if in the second half of the test, students are answering questions closer to their level. So it does alleviate some of that frustration. And it also allows us to zero in on the student score because they're answering more questions around their area. So yeah, it's not item adaptive where it changes after every question like the graduate school GRE, but it is form adaptive. And then if you want me to take the second half, it was about the amount of time, right? The amount of time, the tests are timed for third grade and above, but that timing is not meant to really push students like the college SAT is, where they literally only have 45 seconds per question and they've got to move. The idea is really just that students don't take forever to finish the test. So most students should be able to finish in the time allotted without feeling too rushed. Now, with that said, we know some students, agonize over questions and really focus trying to figure it out. So, time management is also important.
And
Yeah.
Bree, one of the things we also noticed, particularly at the 3rd and 4th grade age range, as students on the younger end of taking the test, they are learning time management more often than not. And this is not only because it's one of their first times taking an assessment like this, but also just developmentally where their brains are at, is they tend to move more quickly rather than running out of time. If we're looking at like sort of percentage of what happens more often than not, they end with more time than they have available. And so some of the coaching that teachers will work with students on is slowing down and keeping their pace. Using the scratch paper helps with that as well. And one of the things we can talk through if you choose to meet with us over the summer is looking at how much time was allotted to how much time your child took. And that can help us understand a little bit more about who each child is as a developing test taker.
We also had a question about accommodations for time, extended time. Those will be happening this year the same way they have in previous years. So if your child has documented accommodations, our Director of Learning Support, Ann King, will be reaching out to families soon with some choices for you to make and let us know about how you want that to look for your child this year. And then the question about scratch paper, I believe we've sort of answered, but to be explicit, on every subtest, children will be given a blank sheet of scratch paper and multiple sharpened pencils. They'll be asked to put their name on the scratch paper. And of course, as part of the prep that we're doing in school, we are encouraging children to use the scratch paper for the tests. We also had a question about previous year reports. Those are something that we can pull for you. I don't think there's a way for families to just do that on their own. So I think reaching out
Yeah.
to
You would need
Deborah.
to reach out. Yeah, if you could reach out to, if you're interested in previous score reports, Deborah McCullum at the front desk can pull those for you. So the first year we take those tests is in third grade. So the earliest year your child would have it is third grade year, unless of course they were in third grade last year and we don't have results for last year.
We do still have a few more minutes. If anybody else has a question that hasn't been answered yet, we'd love to hear from you either in the chat or just feel free to unmute. I'll stop sharing so we can see each other a little better.
Jevzi, I see your hand is raised. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Connie. I wanted to ask about the prep that you will do for kids at school, right? I believe you will be preparing them.
Yes.
And could you tell us a little bit more about that? When that will happen and what kind of, how many days that will be? And I want to kind of try to help them at home as well around the same time.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it'll depend a little bit on the grade level, exactly which day teachers will be starting it. But starting next week and then the following week, teachers in every grade level will be doing multiple short lessons, getting children ready for the ERBs. And the first one is a little bit more like big picture, just, hey, this is coming up. This is what the test is for, and I shared some of those messages earlier. The teachers are using language like, this test helps us understand what you know really well and what we can best teach you next. It's part of how teachers make plans for students. They'll also be giving just like some logistical information, like when we're going to take it starting Monday, May 3rd, we're going to do it in class. It'll be on your iPad, things like that. And then we'll also be doing a lesson about sort of basic test strategies. So strategies to use on every question. So things like that: read, work, predict, choose, kind of walking through children using specific ERB test questions, projecting those and practicing. Okay, so the first thing we do is read the question really carefully. We're looking for words like never or always to make sure we really know what the question is asking. The next step after read is work. We're working to jot some things on our scratch paper, or maybe to kind of with our pencil on the screen, kind of point for ourselves, what's the specific context or piece of this question that I need to think the most about. Then we're thinking in our mind, like, what would be the best answer to this question, either based on the maybe math work that I've just done on my paper, or based on the context reading that I've just done from the question. And then after they think, oh, the best answer would be something like this, or maybe it's a very specific thing, like the best answer would be 42, then we're reading all the answer choices to find the match. And then, so that's kind of another lesson, or like strategies for every question. And that one also includes things about the inner coach and kind of ways to help yourself use your deep breaths to feel less nervous. And then another lesson is sort of like looking at, what about when read, work, predict, choose doesn't work? So what if, like, I'm being asked a vocab question and I just don't know the word, like I don't know what the word means. What can I do? Or what if it's a math question and I try to do the scratch work and then I just, like, none of the answers match my scratch work, or the question was too hard. I didn't even really know how to finish it. So we'll be giving children more strategies for things like, how they can break a word into parts, or how they can eliminate a wrong answer and then guess on a math question, even for one that they can't work out all the way themselves. And then the final, or somewhere in between those two strategy sessions, then children are also taking the tutorial on the iPad. And that's really more about navigation, just making sure that they're feeling really comfortable with like, okay, when I touch this part of the screen, what happens? Or like, if I need to go back a question, can I, and how does that work? And they'll also practice at that point using those review screens.
That sounds all great. Thank you.
Thank you.
We will try to emphasize those messages and strategies at home as well after you've done it at school. And I think it will take some effort to get that internalized by our children, because it's stressful. We will not try to make it more stressful for them, but they know it's a test and they're going to be feeling stressed. So yeah, we'll try to coach that a little bit.
Thank you. I saw a question in the chat too that Layla already answered, or someone did. Oh no, Colleen, you answered it. I was like, Layla, how did you know? Yeah, we will be taking all of the subtests in the morning, and children will still have recess and specials and things. And also there are other regular classes during every time that they're not taking one of the subtests. And then the result reports will come out kind of early in the summer. I'm not sure on the exact date on that yet, but it's usually sometime in June.
It's usually mid-June when we share second semester reports with families following the close of school.
I see a question also about whether the scores are forwarded to high schools. That's something that the family would do as part of an application process, or would request that those scores would be sent. So it's not something that Hillbrook would do just on our own or without kind of your family's partnership or request to do that. And whether a high school wants your child's middle school ERB scores depends a lot on the kind of school. And so if you're already sort of thinking about specific schools, Eden would be a great resource for asking what are the different grade levels, like how far back, how many years back are they interested in seeing those ERB scores. But also as your child gets a little older, she can help you kind of think about how big of a piece of the child's application are, say, their 7th grade ERB scores. Thank you all so much. We will stick around, and thank you, Jason, for your time. Jason is on the East Coast, so it is very late for him. So we really appreciate you being here, and we really appreciate all of the families who stayed with us after your days are ending. Colleen and I will stick around for a couple of minutes if you still have a question that you were hoping to get answered and didn't get yet. And we look forward to seeing you at another parent family education event soon.
And if you talk with anyone who's interested in today's presentation, we will provide a recording of it and a brief written summary in this weekend's Hillbrook happenings.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye, Jason.
Bye,
Thank
Elsa.
you.
Bye, Colleen.
Hi, guys. It's Holly Gentle.
Yeah.
So do you think typically 5th grade scores would be required for private high schools?
I don't know that I've ever heard of a high school being interested in 5th grade scores. I would say even 6th is unusual.
Okay, so it's mostly like 7th and 8th grade scores, but it is common that the private schools will ask for ERB.
Well, I don't even know that I would say it's common, and I'm going to get out of my depth a little bit here pretty soon, so you'd want to confirm this with Eden. Most private high schools that are interested in using standardized testing as part of their admissions are actually more interested in choosing the standardized test that you use. And it often is, like for a Catholic school, they want to use usually the HSPT. If it's an independent school, sometimes they want you to take the IC, sometimes they want you to take the SSAT. So often what we see is actually that children may be starting in 7th grade, late 7th grade year, will start, if families are wondering about that and wanting to make sure kids are prepared, sometimes kids will do like a little bit of extra practice in those tests. So like IC and SSAT put out their own prep booklets where you can kind of learn about the tests and practice. There are also, I'm sure, a lot of people in this area who offer, tutoring or things like that with it. But then usually the child would take it within kind of the late 7th grade to early 8th grade year, schedule a time to take that test specifically. So it looks a little bit more like a college entrance. You would go and sit for the IC or the HSPT, and then that's usually the score that the high school is the most interested in. But they would often ask for maybe a 7th grade ERB as just like an additional piece of data.
Okay, great.